There once lived a great lord who was blessed with the birth of a daughter whom he named Talia. He sent for the wise men and astrologers in his lands to predict her future. They met, counselled together, and cast her horoscope, and at length they came to the conclusion that she would incur great danger from the splinter of a flax. Her father therefore forbade that any flax, hemp, or any other material of that sort be brought into his house, so that she should escape the predestined danger. One day, when Talia had grown into a young and beautiful lady, she was looking out of the window when she beheld passing that way an old woman who was spinning. Talia, never having seen a distaff or a spindle, was pleased to see the twirling spindle, and she was so curious as to what that thing was that she asked the old woman to come to her. Taking the distaff from her hand, she began to stretch the flax. Unfortunately, Talia ran a splinter of flax under her nail, and she fell dead upon the ground. When the old woman saw this, she became frightened and ran down the stairs and is running still. As soon as the wretched father heard of the disaster which had taken place, he had them, after having paid for his tub of sour wine with casks of tears, lay her out in one of his country mansions. They seated her on a velvet throne under a canopy of brocade. Wanting to forget all and to drive from his memory his great misfortune, he closed the doors and abandoned forever the house where he had suffered his great loss. After a time, it happened by chance that a king was out hunting and passed that way. One of his falcons escaped from his hand and flew into the house by way of one of the windows. It did not come when called, so the king had one of his party knock at the door, believing the palace to be inhabited. Although he knocked for a length of time, nobody answered, so the king had them bring a vintner's ladder, for he himself would climb up and search the house to discover what was inside. Thus he climbed up and entered and looked in all the rooms and nooks and corners, and was amazed to find no living person there. At last he came to the salon, and when he, the king, beheld Talia, who seemed to be enchanted, he believed that she was asleep, and he called her, but she remained unconscious. Crying aloud, he beheld her charms and felt his blood course hotly through his veins. He lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bed, where he gathered the first fruits of love. Leaving her on the bed, he returned to his kingdom, where in the pressing business of his realm, he for the time thought no more of this incident. Now, after 9 months, Talia delivered 2 beautiful children, one a boy and the other a girl. In them could be seen 2 rare jewels, and they were attended by 2 fairies, who came to the palace and put them at their mother's breasts. Once, however, they sought the nipple, and not finding it, began to suck on Talia's finger, and they sucked so much that the splinter of flax came out. Talia awoke as if from a long sleep, and seeing beside her 2 priceless gems, she held them at her breast and gave them the nipple to suck, and the babies were dearer to her than her own life. Finding herself alone in that palace with 2 children by her side, she did not know what had happened to her, but she did not notice that the table was set and the food and drink were brought to her, although she did not see any attendants. In the meanwhile, the king remembered Talia, and saying that he wanted to go hunting, he returned to the palace and found her awake, and with 2 cupids of beauty. He was overjoyed, and he told Talia who he was, how he had seen her, and what had taken place. When she heard this, their friendship was knitted with tighter bonds, and he remained with her for a few days. After that time, he bade her farewell and promised to return soon and take her with him to his kingdom. And he went to his realm, but he could not find any rest, and at all hours he had in his mouth the names of Talia and of the sun and the moon. And when he took his rest, he called either one or the other. Now the king's wife began to suspect that something was wrong from the delay of her husband while hunting, and hearing him name continually Talia, sun, and moon. She became hot with another kind of heat than the sun. Sending for the secretary, she said to him,
"Listen to me, my son. You are living between 2 rocks, between the post and the door, between the poker and the grate. If you will tell me whom the king, your master, and my husband is in love with, I will give you treasures untold. And if you hide the truth from me, you will never be found again, dead or alive."
The man was terribly frightened, but greed and fear blinded his eyes to all honour and to all sense of justice. And he related to her all things, calling bread, bread, and wine, wine. The queen, hearing how matters stood, sent the secretary to Talia, and in the name of the king, asking her to send the children, for he wished to see them. Talia, with great joy, did as she was commanded. Then the queen, with the heart of Medea, told the cook to kill them and to make them into several tasty dishes for her wretched husband. But the cook was tender-hearted, and seeing these two beautiful golden apples, felt pity and compassion for them, and he carried them home to his wife and had her hide them. In their place he prepared 2 lambs and 200 different dishes. When the king came, the queen with great pleasure had the food served. The king ate with delight, saying,
"By the life of Lamphusa, how tasteful this is! Or by the soul of my ancestors, this is good."
Each time she replied,
Eat, eat. You are eating of your own.
For 2 or 3 times the king paid no attention to this repetition, but at last, seeing that the music continued, he answered,
"I know perfectly well that I am eating of my own, because you have brought nothing into this house."
And growing angry, he got up and went to the villa at some distance from this palace, to solace his soul and alleviate his anger. In the meanwhile, the queen, not being satisfied of the evil already done, sent for the secretary and told him to go to the palace and to bring Talia back, saying that the king longed for her presence and was expecting her. Talia departed as soon as she heard these words, believing that she was following the commands of her lord, for they greatly longed to see her. For knowing now what was preparing for her, she was met by the queen, whose face glowed from the fierce fire burning inside her, and looked like the face of Nero, and she addressed her thus:
Welcome, Madam Busybody. You're a fine piece of goods. You will weed. Who are you enjoying? My husband? So you are the lump of filth, the cruel bitch that has caused my head to spin. Change your ways, for you are welcome in purgatory, where I will compensate for all the damage you have done to me.
Talia, hearing these words, began to excuse herself, saying that it was not her fault, because the king, her husband, had taken possession of her territory when she was drowned in sleep. But the queen would not listen to her excuses, and had a large fire lit in the courtyard of the palace, and commanded that Talia should be cast into it. The lady, perceiving that matters had taken a bad turn, knelt before the queen and begged her to at least to take off her garments she wore. The queen, not for pity of the unhappy lady, but to gain also the robes which were embroidered with gold and pearls, told her to undress, saying,
You can take off your clothes. I agree.
Talia began to take them off, and with every item that she removed, she uttered a loud scream. Having taken off her robes, her skirt, the bodice of her shift, and she was on the point of removing her last garment when she uttered the last scream, louder than the rest. They dragged her towards the pile to reduce her to lye ashes, which would be used to wash Garen's breeches.